The desert stars were colder than they looked, scattered like frozen fire across the ink of night. A rusted transport truck rumbled across the dry plain, its tires kicking up red dust like blood from an old wound. Inside, dim yellow light bathed the man's face, roughened by wind and time. His name was Hale, and he had seen wars, loved, and lost, and now he delivered cargo across the outer reach to survive. But this time, the cargo wasn't crates of ore or scavenged tech. It was alive. In the reinforced compartment behind him, sealed in a titanium cage, were two beings, one tall, thin, with eyes too wide and sorrowful to belong to anything cruel, and the other no bigger than a child's shadow. Alien, yes, unmistakably so. The mother's skin shimmered faintly like water and moonlight, opalescent, shifting as if it could never decide what color to be. The child clung to her, half hidden beneath a silken membrane that had torn in places. They had no translator, no names he could understand, just the silent, aching bond between them. Hale hadn't been told what they were. The job was simple. Pick up from the backwater lab, drive to Garzon Station, hand them over to Sector 9 agents. High payout, no questions asked. But when he saw them loaded into the truck shaking, silent, the mother covering her child like she expected knives, he knew something was wrong. He'd hauled dangerous things before. Weapons, poisons, failed experiments. Those things snarled, pulsed, or buzzed with dread. But this was grief. Pure, thick, and quiet like a funeral in the snow. Every mile they traveled, the sense deepened. Not fear of pain, but of being lost, erased. Like someone had torn them from their home, their story, and now wanted to end the last page. He didn't speak to them. Didn't know how, but he watched through the rear camera. She didn't sleep, not once. She would press her face to the bars and hum softly, vibrations more felt than heard, maybe to soothe the child or remind herself they were still real. Child trembled in sleep, sometimes crying out in sounds too complex for any human throat, and she would wrap herself around him like a cloak of love. Hale's hands tightened on the wheel. He didn't like this job. Too clean, too quiet, too expensive, and now too full of ghosts. Still, he told himself, money was money. What did he owe a dying species? He was just a driver. Just surviving, but the questions came anyway. Where was their world? What happened to their kind? Why were they alone? Why were they worth so much to the people who said nothing and paid in untraceable chips? His sleep broke into shards that night, and in the mirror of the desert sky, he imagined his daughter's eyes, long gone now, and saw the child's in their place. Alien, yes. But terrified just the same. At dawn, he stopped at a forgotten outpost to refuel. Dust coated everything. A single vending drone buzzed overhead like a lazy hornet. No patrols. No questions. Good. He walked around the back and unlocked the external ventilation hatch. More habit than purpose, and saw them up close for the first time. The mother did not flinch. She only looked at him, not with hatred or fear, but something else. Surrender. Not the kind that comes from weakness, but from knowing the world no longer listens. Her arms pulled the child closer, and her gaze said, "Do what you came to do. We will not scream." And something inside Holly cracked, not loudly, not even clearly. Like a hairline fracture in old glass, silent but dangerous. He looked at her really. Looked, not as cargo, not as alien, but as a mother. As a person. And for the first time in a long, long time, he felt something rise in him that had nothing to do with war, money, or orders. He closed the hatch gently, walked back to the cab. Sat there for a long time. The comm buzzed. A voice cold, clicked asked for confirmation. En route, no issues. He almost said it. Almost told them about the pause, the doubt. But he didn't. He lied. The way soldiers and broken men learn to do without blinking. As the engine roared to life again. Hale drove on into the sunrise. But everything had changed. Not outside, not yet. But deep within the skin of the moment, the road had forked, and he no longer knew where it led. Asterisk, asterisk, the sun crawled higher, washing the barren landscape in bruised gold. But inside the truck, the air remained thick with silence. Hale kept one hand on the wheel, the other gripping the worn leather armrest as if it were the only thing anchoring him to this world. His mind, though, was not here. It lingered in that moment behind the cargo. Hold those eyes, that look. It haunted him like an echo that wouldn't die. He hadn't seen fear like that since the siege at Tarzan 5, when the civilians huddled in the craters and prayed for mercy as orbital fire rained down like metal rain. But this wasn't war. Not anymore. This was something else. Something crueler. Because it was quiet, clean, sanctioned, paid for, he turned off the comms. told himself it was just interference. But really, he didn't want to hear their voices anymore. Didn't want to hear the confirmation calls, the cold efficiency that made it all seem normal. Cargo, delivery, payment, as if he were moving crates. Not lives. The road bent through a dried riverbed, and the truck rocked violently as it passed over ancient fractures in the earth. In the rear camera, the child stirred, eyes fluttering open. Its mouth opened in a breathless whimper. Hale's hand reached toward the console before he realized what he was doing, fingers brushing the volume control to quiet the engine's growl. The mother stirred too, instinctively wrapping her arms tighter around the small form. She looked up at the camera, just a moment, but it pierced him. Not accusation, not blame, just a weary, endless question. Why? He pulled over. Dust settled like tired snow around the wheels as Hale stepped down onto the ground, breathing in air that tasted of rust and dry roots. He walked to the back of the truck slowly, each step like wading through wet cement. The door to the rear chamber hissed open, and this time he didn't stand outside. He entered. The moment he crossed the threshold, the mother tensed. Her back arched slightly, shielding her child, her fingers glowing faintly blue, subtle but clear. A warning, a plea. Hale raised both hands, palms forward, and knelt slowly to show he wasn't a threat. His knees ached, gravel biting into them, but he didn't move. I don't know what you are, he said softly. But I can see you're hurting. The words were meaningless to her, maybe. No translator chip in her skull, no language bridge. But tone, expression, those things were older than speech. She watched him, eyes wide, body still. The child peeked out from beneath her arms, tiny face marked by strange lines that shimmered when it blinked. It looked more curious than scared. Hale didn't reach for them, just stayed where he was, talking slowly, gently, like he used to speak to his daughter when she cried after nightmares. They said you were dangerous, said to keep you locked down. But you don't look dangerous. You look like a mother trying to keep her baby alive. A long silence. Then the child whimpered again, a high, floating sound like wind through broken. Glass in Hale's heart clenched. The mother whispered something in return, a word maybe, or a melody. Her voice was soft, full of broken stars. I've got water, Hale said, moving slowly. He pulled a flask from his belt and placed it gently on the floor between them, then backed away. No sudden moves. The mother stared, eyes flicking between him and the metal container. After a few seconds, she reached out, never letting go of the child, and touched the flask. She sniffed it, then drank. Only a sip. Then she gave the rest to her child, who sucked the water like it was life itself. Hale watched, a lump forming in his throat. They were parched, left without even that basic need. Transported like animals, not even offered a drink. Sat there with them for a long time, just breathing, just watching. The truck systems beeped in the background warnings about route delays. Off-course signals, missed check-ins, but he didn't care. Something bigger was unfolding here. Something that couldn't be mapped by coordinates or programmed into a delivery schedule. The mother slowly reached out, not to him, not exactly. But she extended one thin, luminous finger and touched the floor between them. A soft light shimmered. Where her skin met metal, forming a symbol. 3 loops. One large, 2 small. It pulsed softly, then faded. A message. I don't know what that means, Hale whispered. But I think I get it. He stood up at last, bones aching, heart heavier. Closed the door behind him, but not with the same detachment as before. Now it was an act of protection, a shield. Not a cage. Back in the cab, he pulled up the nav. The route was clear, but his mind was not. The station was a day away, and waiting there were people who didn't ask questions, who only cared about results. They'd pay him and vanish, and the mother and child would disappear into something darker than any battlefield. His hands hovered over the controls, and then, slowly, deliberately, he turned the truck off dash course. It wasn't much, just a few degrees, but enough to change everything. The stars shifted slowly above them as the truck hummed down a path not found on any of the standard nav maps. Guided by old instincts and forgotten roads Hale had once used during his smuggling days, when borders were blurred and choices were made not by law but by conscience. The land here was wilder, more raw cracked hills rising like broken teeth, valleys folded in ancient silence. There were no eyes here. No satellites to report deviations, only wind and the occasional flicker of something animal in the distance. It was the kind of place where truths could survive, if only briefly, before the world came crashing in. Inside the rear hold, Hale had modified the restraints. The cage door now lay open, not in surrender, but in quiet trust. He hadn't spoken. To anyone since he cut the tracker cord and ditched the ID transponder in the riverbed, he was off-grid now. Alone with the beings he had once agreed to sell. That shame lingered in him like a fever. He tried not to think about what might have happened had he not looked into their eyes. But the guilt curled up beneath his ribs anyway, gnawing, reminding him that some roads to redemption were carved in pain. The mother, whom he had started calling Lyra, in his thoughts named after an old lullaby his wife used to sing, had begun to understand that he meant them no harm. She no longer flinched when he approached, no longer shielded the child with trembling limbs. Her eyes still held sorrow, but now they softened when he brought food or sat nearby, whispering human words he knew she didn't grasp. It didn't matter. Emotion traveled through voice, not always meaning. The child Hale thought of him as. Key was the first to bridge the gap. While Lyra remained cautious, Key's natural curiosity was unbroken by trauma. He would crawl forward on unsteady limbs, eyes wide with wonder, reaching out with fingers that glowed faintly when excited. Hale discovered this one night as he sat with a ration pack open in his lap, trying to coax the boy into eating. Key had stared at the glowing heating coil inside the wrapper, then pressed a finger to it, and the entire pack flickered with bioluminescent light, reacting to his touch like a sympathetic flame. Ha laughed, the sound strange in his own throat. He hadn't heard himself laugh in so long. Key responded with a clicking chirp, something between a hiccup and a giggle, and toddled closer. That night, for the first time, the child sat beside him, not afraid. Lyra watched from across the chamber, unmoving, but her eyes shimmered with something that looked like relief, or hope. Hal began talking to them more after that, even if they couldn't understand. He told them stories, not all of them true, but real in feeling. About his daughter, who had died young, her lungs giving out under the pressure of a terraforming accident. About the years he'd spent chasing jobs and burying grief beneath metal and motion. About the way guilt could rot a man from the inside, if he didn't find something to hold on to. He didn't expect answers. He just needed someone to hear Dot, and they did. In their silence, their steady eyes, their small gestures of patience, Hale found something rare, something he hadn't even known he was missing. Lyra began to echo certain tones he used, mimicking the rise and fall of words. Key copied his gestures, tapping his chest when Hale said his name. Hale, the boy would chirp, in a sound not quite human, but close enough to break your heart. Every time it happened, something inside Hal unraveled a little more, like ropes loosening around a weary soul. One night while they were camped, beneath an overhang of stone that shielded them from satellite sweeps, Lyra reached out and touched Hale's hand. Dot. It was nothing at first, just a brush of cool fingers. But then she pressed her palm flat to his, and suddenly he felt a wave of images flood his mind. Not words, not thoughts, emotions, memories. 1,000 flashes of color and sound, a burning sky, the wail of her people, the child being torn from her arms and returned months later, half-starved and experimented on. Her screams muted in sterile halls. Her fight to survive. Her loss of everyone she loved. And in all of it, the quiet, desperate hope that somewhere in the universe, there was still someone who might choose kindness. Hal gasped, stumbling back, tears leaking from his eyes before he realized they'd come. Lyra withdrew, ashamed, perhaps thinking she had hurt him, but he shook his head and whispered, "I'm sorry. I didn't know. She bowed her head, the faint shimmer of her skin pulsing with sorrow. That night, they did not sleep far apart. The truck became more than transport. It became a vessel of slow healing, a cocoon of understanding where 3 souls, 2 alien. One human learned to speak without speaking. Hale found himself waking with purpose again, not dread. The road was still uncertain, the danger not gone, but the bond between them had shifted something essential. He was no longer just a smuggler or a soldier trying to forget. He was a guardian now, not by contract, not by debt, but by choice. And for the first time in years, that choice made him feel like a man again. Asterisk, asterisk, the days rolled on like forgotten prayers whispered into wind, each one bringing them deeper into the broken places of the world, those shadowed gorges and scorched plains where satellites didn't look and lawmen didn't care. Hale kept them moving mostly at night now, driving under the cover of stars with lights dimmed and engines throttled low. Lyra and Key no longer stayed locked in the rear hold. He had opened the dividing wall, turned the passenger bay into a soft nest of blankets, heat coils, and warmth. Lyra often sat near the window now, head tilted as she watched the foreign stars glide past, her expression unreadable but not without peace. Key had claimed a co-pilot seat and spent long stretches there, fiddling with controls he didn't understand, imitating Hale's every move with endearing seriousness. They were a strange crew, silent, broken, stitched together by accident. And something more ancient than words. Survival, but peace is always a shallow lake in a land. Built on storms. It started with a flicker of a blue light on the console. Hale had been driving through a ravine, surrounded by towering rock spires that looked like the bones of long-dead gods, when the signal pinged. A scramble pulse, military grade, designed to mask itself as background radiation unless you were looking for it. Hale froze, his breath caught. Then he tapped the override and played the signal back. A single phrase repeated in synthetic voice. Target has deviated. Initiate phase intercept. Then silence. He didn't tell them right away. Lyra was already tense, her body language shifting with the change in his breathing. He was still too young or innocent to notice the shift in atmosphere, but Hallway felt the weight return like a boot to the chest. Someone was watching, not nearby, not yet, but close enough to hunt. He cut the engine, waited, listened. The wind howled, dry and restless, but nothing stirred. Until he checked the external feed, a drone. High altitude, watching from the edge of atmosphere. It had tracked them for at least a day without alerting. Just gathering data. Hale's blood turned to ice. He knew that model, used by Sector 9 only. It wasn't just a delivery to them, it was a recovery. And if they were tracking this far off-grid, it meant one thing. They didn't want to bring Lyra and Key back alive. He turned in his seat. Lyra met his eyes immediately. She had felt it. Something dark, heavy. Hale knelt down, pulled out an old security case from beneath the floorboards, and unlocked it with his retina scan. Inside was a rusted data tablet, his old war logs. He hadn't touched it in years, not since leaving the service. But now, he loaded it, opened the files, and searched by code. It didn't take long. Project Seraphim. Listed as decommissioned, unregulated, unauthorized xenobiological research. The file was fragmented, scrubbed in parts, but what remained was enough to gut him. The lab where he had picked them up had been one of many, and Lyra, not just a survivor. She had been the prototype. Captured during a planetary raid authorized under false pretense, her species had no standing military, no advanced weapons. But they had something else, neural link potential, a kind of empathy transmission, biological in nature, that allowed emotional understanding across species boundaries. Pure empathy, no barriers. That's why they had been hunted. That's what the scientists wanted. A living conduit for perfect control. Hale shut the tablet, unable to breathe. They hadn't just tortured her. They had tried to weaponize her soul. When he turned to Lyra again, he saw in her posture she knew. Somehow she had always known what he would find. She didn't cry, didn't rage, just lowered her head in quiet defeat. He crawled into her arms, confused by the sorrow in the air. Lyra held him tight, her skin dimming to a bruised violet hue. Hale couldn't speak, could only kneel there, crushed beneath the gravity of what he now carried. They were trying to breed it, this gift, this sacred emotional bond in Lyra. And Key were the last two known to possess it. The others had all died. Used up, dissected, lost. He stood, a rage creeping into his voice, his bones. Not loud, not wild, but focused, sharp, the kind of fury that shaped revolutions and broke chains. "They're coming for you," he whispered, "and I'm not going to let them take you again." The road ahead had changed shape. It was no longer about hiding or escape. It was about protection, resistance, a choice between complicity and defiance. Hale had done nothing when his daughter died, lost to the indifference of a cold system. He had been silent, numb, floating through jobs like a ghost. But now, standing here, watching a mother cradle her child in the ruins of what was once hope, he knew silence was no longer an option. Lyra reached out, touched his chest. Her hand glowed faintly, and in that moment, he felt her pain, but also her trust. Her belief that this man, broken and lost as he was, could be something more. The drone signal returned. Closer now. Sector 9 was closing in, but Hale was done running, and he would not let history repeat itself. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The desert wind howled harder now, as if sensing what was coming. The dust turned sharp in the air, scraping against the truck's worn hull as Hale barreled through a narrowing canyon path, one eye on the road, the other on the flickering threat display. Drones were multiplying. 3 now, then 5. Shadowy blips on the radar, high and circling like vultures waiting for something to die. He had evaded plenty in his time, smugglers and bounty agents, and even border patrols, but these weren't amateurs. Sector 9 wasn't just hunting. They were preparing for a surgical extraction, The kind that ended with no witnesses and no survivors. Key had fallen asleep beside him, curled like a kitten in the co-pilot's chair, tiny breath fogging. The glass. Lyra remained in the back, silent but watchful, her skin dimmed to a dull gray, like she was hiding her light to save what little strength she had. Hale had tried to offer her reassurance, to say they'd make it out, but every word he said felt small in the face of what chased them now. There was no safe place left, only delays. And the closer they came, the louder the ghosts of his past became. The faces of his fallen crew, the doctors who turned dying soldiers into test subjects. The officers who called it necessary. He gripped the wheel so hard his knuckles turned pale. Then the warning siren screamed low altitude approach. Incoming vessel. The truck systems flashed red, and above them, the sky split open. A transport cruiser, black and silent, fell from the clouds like a descending judgment. Hale knew. That shape. Sector 9's rapid retrieval model. It didn't need to land. It could deploy hunter pods, pick apart a vehicle in seconds. He swerved the truck off the road, dirt flying in gray arcs behind him, and veered into a ravine where the cruiser couldn't follow, but he had only minutes. He stopped beneath an outcrop of jagged, stone-empowered everything down engine. Comes, even the heater coils. The world went still. He stirred, sensing the change. Lyra moved forward, crouching beside Hale in the dark. She didn't speak, but her eyes asked the question he couldn't answer. What now? He looked around, heart pounding. He had weapons, yes, but nothing that could take on a military drone strike. He had nowhere left to hide. And then he remembered the caves. Back when he ran routes through this stretch, smugglers had used the old mineral caves in the Atros Ridge to stash stolen goods and hide from patrols. They were narrow and winding and impossible to track by satellite unless you knew where to look. And he did. We're leaving the truck, he whispered. Now. He scooped Key up in his arms, wrapped him in an old flight jacket. Lyra followed, moving like a ghost. Hale popped the side hatch, and the three of them slipped out into the bitter air. The cruiser above loomed closer, scanning the landscape with beams of pale light. Hale led them along the ridge, boots crunching against gravel, lungs burning. Every second counted. The cave entrance wasn't far, maybe 100 meters, but with every step, the sky seemed to hum louder. Then came the whir of descent thrusters. Pods. Hall pushed harder, pulling Lyra along when she stumbled. Key whimpered in his arms, but stayed quiet, instinctive and trusting. The rocks ahead shifted, and there, half buried by time and dust, the narrow crack in the cliff wall opened like a mouth of salvation. He squeezed through, then turned, and helped Lyra, her thin form just able to fit through the gap. Inside, the cave was cold and wet, the walls slick with ancient minerals. Darkness swallowed them, but Hale used a low-beam headlamp, careful not to emit too much light. They crawled deeper, following old path markers he'd left years ago. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what he carried. They couldn't run forever. They needed a plan. Deep inside, the cave widened into a small chamber where the signal interference would be strong. Hale set Key down on a blanket of old thermal mesh. Lyra knelt beside her son, whispering to him in their strange musical tongue. Hale sat down opposite them, back against the wall, breathing hard. They won't stop, he said, voice low. They're not here to take you back. They're here to end it. Clean slate. They can't afford for anyone to know what they did to your kind. Lyra looked at him. Then slowly she reached out again, and for the second time touched his forehead. But this time it was not just her memories. It was a vision. He saw her people again, tall, radiant, walking under trees made of light. Cities not built, but grown. A world without war, where emotion was not a weakness but language. He saw Lyra as she once was, a teacher, a healer. And then the invasion, the burning, the cages, the labs, and the hope, the single note of desperate prayer, that her son might one day carry what was left of their beauty into a world that could understand. When she pulled back, Hale was shaking. You're not just refugees, he whispered. You're the last memory of something better. Outside, the sound of boots and synthetic armor echoed faintly. The hunter pods were on foot now, scanning the thermal sweeps. Time was running out, but Hale wasn't the same man he was days ago. He wasn't a courier anymore. He was a witness, a protector. And somewhere inside his scarred soul, a spark of something human, resilient, fierce, an unyielding caught flame. He dug into his pack and pulled out the last tool that might make a difference. A pulse flare beacon, normally used for rescue missions. Modified, it could blind scans long enough to create a window. And with a decoy loop attached to the truck's I-core, maybe, just maybe, they'd think they found their targets. He looked to Lyra. If I do this, I'll have to draw them away, alone. Her hand found his again. This time, there were no images, no visions, just warmth. Just gratitude. And Holly knew what he had to do. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The cave was still. His breath held too long. Darkness curled in the corners like a coiled predator, waiting for the first mistake. Hale stood at the narrow entrance, the cold night wind licking against his face, carrying with it the hum of the enemy. He could hear them now closer, more certain, metallic boots on gravel. The soft, rhythmic ticking of proximity scanners. Sector 9 didn't waste time with warnings or questions. Their mission was simple. Erase the breach, cleanse the data, leave nothing behind but scorched silence. Hale looked back one last time. Lyra sat with Key nestled in her lap, their bodies pressed together like a single shape of light in the shadows. She didn't try to stop him. She didn't cry or plead. But her eyes, they shimmered with emotion so raw it cracked something open in him that he hadn't known was still there. She was telling him something, though no words passed between them. He understood anyway. Protect him. At any cost. Hull nodded once, heart hammering, and turned away before the weight of that gaze could paralyze him. He moved fast, slipping out into the night and back down the ridge toward the truck, keeping low, zigzagging between rocks and outcrops. The stars above blinked in and out behind drifting cloud, and the land glowed faintly red from the ship's undercarriage still, idling above the valley like a waiting god. The flare beacon was hot in his pocket, already primed. His other hand gripped the decoy transmitter, a cracked I-core from the truck, rigged to broadcast biometric echoes of Lyra and Key. It wouldn't last long, maybe 10 minutes at most, but it might be enough. Enough to make them believe they'd found their quarry. Enough to lead them away. He reached the truck and slid underneath it, the gravel biting into his skin. The pod lights swept overhead, burning white, slicing through the dark. He didn't flinch. Years of military training had turned fear into focus. He latched the core onto the truck's dashboard relay, activated the decoy signal, then punched the beacon hard into the dirt, shoving it into the earth like planting a final hope. A moment later, the flare erupted. Blinding light burst into the night, not flame, but electromagnetic chaos, white waves sweeping through the air, frying radar scans, disorienting heat sensors. It was the signal of a cornered animal ready to explode. And it worked. From above, the cruiser shifted. A deep mechanical groan echoed through the valley as two of the hunter pods pivoted and descended toward the flare. Boots pounded toward the truck. Orders crackled over encrypted comms. Hale heard it all, but he didn't wait to celebrate. He ran, not back toward the cave. That would be death. He ran the opposite direction, up into the jagged cliffs that lined the valley, drawing their eyes with every step. The last hunter pod spotted him and broke away, giving chase, its spot beam slicing through the dark and catching his shoulder. He tumbled once, pain shooting through his ribs, but got back up, gritted his teeth, kept running. They didn't want him. Not really. But the signature was close enough, and their orders were clear: eliminate anything that moved. He reached the crest of the ridge and dropped behind a cluster of stone pillars, heart thundering, blood hot in his mouth. The drone's whine closed. In. Then the pod landed with a bone-rattling thud 10 meters away. He was out of time. He reached into his coat, pulled the old EMP charge he'd stolen years ago from a pirate cache. It was unstable, probably lethal this close, but he didn't care. He looked down at the trigger. Just one press, one burst. He stared into the night and thought of Key's eyes, of Lyra's hand on his chest, of the voice that had told him once, long ago, that humans were born to take, to destroy. But that wasn't all they were. They could protect, too. They could choose, he whispered. Not this time. The drone moved in. He pressed the trigger. A burst of silent white exploded outward, not with sound, but with gravity-collapsing light heat signal. The drone systems failed mid-flight, crashing into the ridge with a scream of twisting. Metal. Sparks flared, then died. Smoke rose. Hale was thrown backward, vision spinning, ribs cracked. His body hit stone, slid, then stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing. Only silence. Only sky dot, then he blinked. Breath caught in his chest like a failing engine, shallow, rattling. Pain flowered behind his eyes. But he was alive, and he had bought them time. Down in the valley, the other pods had converged on the truck, unaware that the real quarry had long since slipped into the veins of the earth. Hale couldn't see them now, but he didn't need to. He felt it in his bones, in the quiet certainty that they were still safe, that they would have a chance now. because he'd made it so. Footsteps approached, cautious, armored. Sector 9. Soldiers sweeping the ridge. Hale didn't move. Didn't breathe. Let them find him, he thought. Let them take me. He'd drawn the fire. That was the point. And in that moment, bloody, broken, hidden beneath the bones of the world, Hale finally felt whole. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The wind settled into something like peace. The dust, once flung wild by battle and fear, drifted quietly over the canyon, covering broken metal and the scar Hale had carved into the earth with his defiance. The Sector 9 strike force had swept through the valley in force, found the decoy signal, neutralized what they thought were traces of alien life, and departed. No bodies recovered, no living subjects extracted. Only wreckage. And Hale, burned, broken, unconscious beneath the lip of the ridge, was taken as collateral. One man. No questions asked. They assumed he was smuggling. Maybe even running interference. For black market tech. They didn't care. What mattered was that the anomaly had been handled. 2 days passed before Hale woke again. The cell was sterile. Small, more holding bay than prison. No sunlight reached inside. Just buzzing lights, the hum of distant machinery, and the stale air of bureaucracy. A field medic had stitched his ribs, rehydrated his blood, and left him under a sedative drip. They didn't interrogate him. Not yet. He wasn't important. Not enough to matter. He had no family on file, no living ties, no employer willing to claim him. Just another man lost in the gears of protocol, but none of that mattered, because somewhere out there beyond the surveillance net, past the claws of men who turned love into an experiment, Lyra and Key were alive. That was all that mattered. In a monitoring station far from the prison complex, a young technician reviewed the mission logs. She was bored, hungry, clicking through signal distortions from the failed retrieval operation. One file, encrypted but flagged as unimportant, caught her eye. A corrupted pulse log. She opened it absent-mindedly. And froze. It wasn't data. It was a fragment of memory, a vision, accidentally captured and broadcast when Lyra had touched Hale's skin during that final goodbye. A flash of her homeworld, of trees glowing in soft blue light, of a child laughing, wild and free, of a man-human kneeling. Before them, not as conqueror, but as protector, the tech stared, lips parting. What the hell is this? She whispered, but before she could call it in, the file erased itself. An embedded protocol Hale had left in place just in case. He'd learned a few tricks from his time as a soldier. Leave only wonder, no proof. Only a feeling. The seed was planted. Hope, after all, didn't need permission to grow. Far beyond that station. Through dry ravines and forgotten caves, Lyra and Key walked beneath a sky filled with unfamiliar stars. Key rode on her back, his laughter a soft tune that echoed through the empty canyons. They were moving still, always moving, but the air around them felt lighter now. The world no longer pressed in like a trap, but opened slightly just enough. To breathe. In her palm, Lyra carried a small object, Hale's badge. He had left it wrapped around a ration packet, pressed into her hand with a final wordless promise. She clutched it often, especially when fear threatened to rise again. Not because it was a tool or a symbol of protection, but because it was his. A piece of him. She had seen inside him, just as he had seen inside her. Not all of humanity was lost. Some were like him. Tired, scarred, yes, but capable of choosing love over law, empathy over ease. Key chirped a sound. A new word. Hey. L, he said softly. Lyra smiled, though her eyes shone with tears. Yes, she whispered, the sound shaped by a language not her own. Hale. Back in the prison complex, Hale stared at the ceiling, his body still aching, every breath a challenge. But inside deep, buried beneath pain and failure and exhaustion, was something steady. Something warm. They were free. He had given something no one had ever asked him for before. A second chance, not just for them, but for himself. He didn't know what would come next. Whether he would rot in that cell, or be shipped to another hellhole, or disappear like all the others who went off script. But he knew what he had done. And for the first time in his life, he didn't regret it. Somewhere, in the vast dark between systems, stories would be told. Not by governments, not in reports, but in whispers, in songs. Of a man who chose to stand, not because he was strong, but because he was kind. Of a soldier who broke orders to protect a mother and her child. Of a human who, when faced with the choice to profit from pain, chose instead to bleed so that others might live. And maybe, just maybe, those stories would light fires in other hearts, because humanity was not just claws and conquest. It was also sacrifice. It was also love. It was Also Hale, and that was enough.